Women's brains matter. Well, of course, men's brains matter as well, but this podcast is about why so many women experience cognitive problems with the menopause. My guest today is Dr. Louise Newson. She is a physician, women's hormone specialist, and member of the UK government's menopause task force. She is also an award-winning doctor, educator, and author. And in front of me, I have her brilliant book, The Definitive Guide to the Perimenopause and Menopause. And her knowledge of perimenopause and menopause is second to none. She's described as the medic who kickstarted the menopause revolution. She has empowered a generation of women to have a greater understanding, choice, and control over their treatments, body and mind. Louise, welcome to my podcast.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me. It's great being here.
Now, is it really true that women are more at risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, or age-related cognitive decline?
Yeah, they absolutely are. And the risk increases as we age. There's lots of reasons for it. But in medical school, I'm quite old. I went to medical school in the late 80s, early 90s. I was taught it's because women live longer. But there are other reasons. It's not just because we live longer than men.
Okay, and is there any sort of number that you could put on that in a way to make sure? I mean, what percentage of Alzheimer's cases, for example, are in women compared to men?
I'm not sure the exact figures because it's one of these things with Alzheimer's and dementia, as you know, to get a formal diagnosis is very different to thinking that someone has it. But it's a lot higher. I mean, it's sort of 60, 70% in women. We also know that the longer a woman is menopausal, the higher her chances of dementia. But we have to remember, as I'm sure you and your listeners are very aware, that commonest causes of death now globally are cardiovascular disease and dementia. They're pretty much neck and neck up there. But it's not just dying from something, it's living with it is the problem.
And is this time related, as in, is this really happening from the menopausal years or even before in the
Yeah.
perimenopausal phase?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Well, I think there's two things that we need to sort of really unpick. So menopause is a definition defined on women's periods, which is ridiculous in for lots of reasons because officially you have to be a year since your last period. But for most of us, our hormones decline way before our periods stop. So this perimenopause, this time when we're still having periods, but our hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are starting to fluctuate and change, cause havoc and in our bodies, our cells, our tissues, especially our brains. But the other thing is it's not just estrogen and progesterone. We have testosterone. Men and women produce testosterone. And testosterone is the most biologically active hormone we have in women. But levels start to decline in their late 20s, early 30s. So there are a lot of women with testosterone deficiency who are not yet menopausal. So if we're only waiting for menopause to be thinking about the impact on our brain and memory, we're missing out on a lot of women. And most women who come to our clinic have brain fog, they have memory problems. Every day in my clinic, women say to me, I think I've got dementia. And, I thought I did 8 years ago when I was perimenopausal. I couldn't remember drug doses and names. I couldn't remember my patients' names. So it's very scary when your brain doesn't work properly, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, and so is it sort of in the 40s, a lot of women particularly are getting concerned and getting.
Yeah, so we have to remember that the average, not that any woman is average, of course, but the average age of menopause in the UK is 51, but perimenopause can last a decade or so. So also about 1 in 30 women under the age of 40 have an early menopause. So really, if you think about those figures, women in their 40s are either going to be perimenopausal or menopausal, and most of those will have symptoms affecting their brain. But, for decades, centuries even, we've been gaslit, really, told that it's because we're stressed, we can't cope with our work and our families and our life. And no one's really wondering about the biology of what's going on in our bodies and brain.
And interestingly, in the hundreds of thousands of cognitive function tests that we
Mm,
for the brain, men and women are declining. And by the way, the decline is reasonably linear from the age of 18. It's
mm.
extraordinary. but they're relatively even until sort of late 40s, and then you see this
Mm,
divergence where
mm,
women's cognitive function falls more than men. So
mm,
before we dive into, what's causing this, and of course you've mentioned hormones, testosterone, as well as
mm.
estrogen and progesterone, what are the most common mental or psychological symptoms, as well as physical symptoms? Because after all, the mind is part of the body to look out
Mm.
for. Because some women may think it's just me, but actually, what are the telltale signs that something is not quite right?
Yeah, it's great to us, but everybody's different. So I did a survey recently of about 5,000 women, and the commonest symptoms are those affecting the brain. So memory problems, but also mood changes. So short-temperedness, irritability, low mood, symptoms of depression, forgetfulness, fatigue, like an overwhelming fatigue, not sleeping well. But every single organ, cell in our body responds to hormones. So, working through the body, it can be symptoms such as dry eyes, painful mouths, taste changes, palpitations, breathing problems, digestion problems, dry skin, itchy skin, urinary tract symptoms, cystitis, muscle and joint pains. They're all very common. Not everyone gets every symptom. Some people get one or two symptoms, but some people have several symptoms. And for many of us, symptoms change with time as well. And you wouldn't get the same symptom every day.
And is this a little bit like you weren't getting this some years ago, and now you're starting to get these things? Something's going on. Is that the?
Yeah, but actually, what often happens, as you know, in medicine, you often learn most from asking the right questions to patients. And we know that during our menstrual cycles, when we're still having periods, our hormones are fluctuating, obviously, so we can produce an egg and get our bodies ready for pregnancy. And if we don't fertilize an egg, we have a massive decline of hormones, estrogen and progesterone before we have our periods. So a lot of women, when you really have time to think and reflect and ask the questions, women say, it's very similar to how I felt those day or two before my periods. I got the sugar cravings, I got low mood, I was tearful, I was shouty. But usually it lasted a day or two and my period came and I was better. But the other telltale sign often is that people often say, when I was pregnant, I felt amazing. I felt the best ever. And a lady I saw yesterday, she's 48, and she said, if I could get pregnant again tomorrow, I would, because if I could have that feeling. But we know we've got really high levels of all three hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone in our brains and bodies when we're pregnant. So a lot of women, if they join the dots, but most of us are busy, we just like carry on and then we don't realize that it could be related to our hormonal changes.
Let me just ask you a little bit more about two of the symptoms: brain fog and sleep. When you say sleeping problem,
Mm,
is
yeah.
this primarily difficulty getting to sleep? In other words, switching off, or just not being able to sleep through the
It's a
night?
combination, actually. A lot of people have this overwhelming fatigue, like they're trying to like wade through treacle. They go to bed and then they might drift off to sleep, but they often have quite disrupted and interrupted sleep. Many people say, oh, it's just because they're having night sweats that's waking them up, or because they need to go and pass urine. But actually, a lot of people, their sleep cycle is not so good. So they're waking up, but our hormone levels are at their lowest in the early hours of the morning. So when they wake up for whatever reason, then you're right, they often ruminate, they worry, they have more anxiety, or it might be palpitations that wake them up. But also we know that if we have low estradiol, we also have low melatonin, and melatonin is obviously our sleep hormone as well. So there are lots of reasons why people don't sleep, and it's a very, very common symptom that actually really can improve with hormones.
And brain fog. You were describing
Yeah,
yourself that you couldn't sort of
yeah,
remember that name. So, what
yeah.
does brain fog look like in the context of sort of hormonal problems and women's perimonal phase?
Yeah, it's often people who have hormonal changes often have insights. So, like, for example, what you're picking up and it's something you've got to eat with, but you can't remember the word fork. So and then everything just seems an effort, like your brain is almost aching, like you should be on the ball, you should be able to multitask. Someone's told you something and you just can't retain it. And it's very different to like women that I've seen in the past with dementia don't have this same insight in the same way. But it's everything's just grayed out. Everything's in black and white, and it is literally like you're trying to activate pathways in your brain that you just can't, it just doesn't work. Yeah. It's a bit like if you've got a head cold, that feeling that you know, and you just can't think clearly.
So why do you think this is happening? Not just the brain fog, but all these symptoms. You've obviously mentioned the estrogen, progesterone,
Mm,
testosterone, and melatonin,
yeah.
and so on. But what do you think
Yeah.
is the fundamental biological change that is causing this cascade of issues?
So there's lots of reasons. If we remember that, you know, our hormones work on every single cell in our body, but they work within the cells. So we have receptors on the cells, on the outside, the cytoplasm, on the inside, in the in the nucleus as well. So they work on cells such as our macrophages, which help our inflammation. When we have adequate estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, the macrophages work really well. If they're low levels, the macrophages become pro-inflammatory, they increase inflammation. So they can turn against us. They help with our mitochondria, the powerhouse, the energy of our cells. They've got receptors, mitochondria on. We've got trillions of them in our body. So they help
So many
every
in the
single
brain.
cell process. Yeah, yes, so many in the brain. But if you think about our brain cells, they all respond to hormones. So if we've got those hormones, we've got more going on in our brain. We've got, you know, if you think about the dendritic processes, a bit like branches of a tree, they're going to grow better. They help stimulate nerve growth factors, for example, but also they help with the synapses. So, you know, that sort of transmission of impulses between one nerve to another. The presence of hormones will help, they actually work with that transmission, but they will also help levels of other neurotransmitters. So obviously I've mentioned melatonin, but also serotonin, also dopamine, also glutamate, acetylcholine. All of those will increase in the presence of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. And those three hormones are made in the brain as well. For many, many years, and even now, a lot of people think they are ovarian hormones. They're just about ovaries. And even in men, they're just about the testes. And of course, about half of our hormones is made in those organs, but a lot is made in our brain. A lot of testosterone is converted to estradiol in our brain via aromatase enzymes. And so we know that those hormones work with neuroplasticity. They help with the blood flow to the brain. You know, they help with the myelin sheath, you know, that conducting part of the nerves. So if we don't have those hormones, our myelin isn't produced as well. So, you know, we're not going to have the same quick impulses that we do. So when you unpick the neurophysiology of how hormones work, it's very exciting, it's very interesting, but for some reason it's been ignored by people, and I'm not quite sure why.
Well, the word connection comes up because everything you were describing in terms of symptoms feels like a lack of connection.
Mm,
Thing you describe in terms of hormone function in the brain, but not only in the brain, is sort of how those connections and messages kind of merge
yeah.
together and flow and so on. Now, I was there in the early 80s, and we used to invite Dr. John Lee over
Mm,
to the UK,
yeah.
talks to all the nutritional therapists and doctors
Mm,
and debate the whole subject. And the story then, the essence of it, was that in the perimenopausal phase, if a woman is not ovulating, does not release an egg, they will not be producing sufficient progesterone.
mm,
So even though estrogen or estradiol
mm,
might appear adequate, the progesterone is less. So you have a state of
mm,
estrogen dominance. That's what he was saying. And from progesterone, we can make the testosterone, DHEA, and all the estrogens, including estradiol and cortisol. So the story
mm,
was we get very stressed. We channel the limited supply of progesterone to cortisol, not enough left
mm,
for
mm.
testosterone, estrogen. So how true is that now, and how would you add to that? And
You
kind
see,
of,
I think it's very interesting because even me as a doctor was taught that you just have progesterone for the lining of the womb. It's a womb hormone. But actually, it's made from cholesterol. So our astrocytes, those good cells in our brain, actually help make cholesterol, and the cholesterol converts into progesterone. And you're absolutely right, Patrick, because progesterone forms testosterone and estradiol, but it very importantly produces cortisol as well. So progesterone is a really forgotten, really important hormone. We know from some studies that if there's a brain injury or a stroke, the brain naturally produces more progesterone to actually try and repair the brain. And as you know, there's a constant balance. Our bodies are so clever and wonderful that they're mopping up like all the old cells as well. And they're making that balance of those neurotransmitters good, because if they're too high, it can cause problems. If you've got mitochondria that are dead and lying around, that's not good either. So they're constantly gobbling up. They're really helping. They're reducing oxidative stress. And this is where all three hormones, but especially progesterone, if you met me 5 years ago, I probably would have said estradiol is the most important hormone. A couple of years ago, I probably would have said testosterone. And now I think progesterone's the winner, but they're all three are very good. And John Lee was amazing, but people didn't want to believe him. It was Katrina Dalton as well, who spoke a lot and wrote a lot. Amazing work about progesterone, especially in younger women too, with PMS, premenstrual syndrome, PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, postnatal depression. Yet somehow it's been ignored and confused, because a lot of people, when you talk about progesterone, they think about the progesterone only pill, contraception, which is a synthetic, chemically altered type of progesterone, which will not have the same effects on the brain.
So there's a lot you said that we can unpick, but just for
Mm,
listeners, neurons are the brain cells, which, if you like, are doing the talking. Astrocytes, which are part of what are called glial cells, kind of have at least two functions. One is they're like the fuel cells. So fascinating that they're actually, converting cholesterol into progesterone and so on. They also can be in an anti-inflammatory state or a
mm,
pro-inflammatory state.
mm,
They can make ketones as a fuel for the
mm.
brain cells. So that's just, if you've never heard of an astrocyte,
Yeah.
they're what support the neurons. And yeah, I mean, Catherine Dalton, as I understood it, made a fundamental error, which was that she did studies on rabbits, and rabbits didn't have a menopause in the same way, and they're herbivores, so they couldn't process. This is actually what happened to Anichov, the Russian, in 1913. He fed rabbits cholesterol, and they got blockages in their arteries that looked like,
Mm,
atheromas. And he made the wrong conclusion, because if he'd picked an animal that was not a herbivore, but a carnivore or omnivore like us pigs, you wouldn't see the same thing. So we've heard cholesterol could be really important,
mm,
making
mm,
progesterone, then making this cascade. So let's take a look at estrogen or estradiol, because we've heard a lot about estrogen, and some of it in the context of negativity,
mm,
conventional estrogen, HRT, and then the big study in the British Medical Journal that really kind of put the lid on
mm,
that in relation to increasing breast cancer risk, despite all the claims that estrogen HRT would,
mm,
stop aging, stop heart disease, and so on. So estrogen has had a little bit of a bad rap, and you've mentioned natural progesterone and
mm.
synthetic progesterone, so they're different things. What's the story about estrogen?
So it's very interesting, isn't it? In anything we do, it's really important to be precise and explain what you're talking about. So you're right, there's been so much confusion, and the studies in the past were done on conjugated equine estrogens, which is actually pregnant horses' urine. Because if you think about the history of hormones, when they discovered our hormones, they wanted to commercialize, they wanted to make them pharmaceutical products so they could make money from them. They couldn't get enough natural estrogen. They tried to get it from pregnant women, but they needed massive volumes for a small amount of estrogen. They would never make money from that. So as soon as they discovered that there were estrogens in pregnant horses' urine, they had these massive farms, literally, of pregnant horses that they were just getting the urine from. But as you can imagine, although pregnant horses' urine is natural, it doesn't just contain human estradiol. It contains lots and lots of hormones that we don't actually need as humans. So they gave this type of HRT, but the most important thing is they also gave a synthetic progesterone. So the study you're talking about is the Women's Health Initiative study, the WHI study that came out in 2002. But they gave medroxyprogesterone acetate, which is a very synthetic form of progesterone. It won't stimulate the receptors. It's chemically different. We know it increases risk of inflammation, so stroke, heart attacks, and so forth. When they thought there was an increased risk of breast cancer, they halted the study and reported it out. But when they've looked at the data properly, even the women who only had estrogen of the pregnant horse's urine type actually had a 22% lower incidence of breast cancer. This increased incidence was associated with the women taking the synthetic progesterone, although it wasn't statistically significant. But then they decided to label estrogen as a carcinogenic agent. But there are different types of estrogen. How can natural estradiol be carcinogenic? Because women who are pregnant, young women, have lots of estradiol in their bodies, and the risk of cancer is a lot higher in postmenopausal women who have low levels of estradiol. There are different types of estrogen that we naturally produce. Estradiol is the most beneficial. We also produce estrone, which is a very weak type of estrogen, but it is pro-inflammatory. It can increase inflammation. And in fact, when we become menopausal, if we don't take HRT, our body needs estradiol. It needs it as a natural hormone. So one of the ways it tries to compensate if our ovaries aren't working, is produce it from our adipocytes, our fat cells. Our fat cells produce a very weak type of estrogen, the estrone, but it's not good for us because it can increase inflammation. And then we also have estradiol, another type of hormone. But if you think about pure estradiol, of course, that's the hormone that works in the brain and the body, that reduces inflammation, that helps our mitochondria, that does all these wonderful things to our neurophysiology. But it's been confused so much. In the contraceptive pills, often they contain ethinyl estradiol, which is a synthetic type of estrogen, which has a 300 times affinity more than estradiol to the estradiol receptor. So it will go onto the receptor like a lock and key. It will block the action of estradiol working, and it won't unlock all these lovely cell processes that occur with estradiol. And so we know women with take contraception have a small risk of clot, they have a small risk of heart attack. They also, a lot of them, it blocks serotonin, so they often need antidepressants. It can have all sorts of detrimental effects on the brain. But it's very sort of lazy, in inverted commas, medicine to say estrogen, because you're not defining what it is. And it's very important to know the difference.
And just before leaving that area, an estradiol seems to be coming up as
Mm,
the key sort of natural
mm,
agent in the body. But of course, women are worried about breast cancer. Many, I think 1 in 7 in their life have a breast cancer diagnosis.
mm,
Most will be told that their cancer is, or the cancer cells are estrogen positive.
mm.
Some will have a sort of enforced menopause to cut down
Yeah.
signaling.
Yeah.
So
So it's
what's
very,
going
yeah.
on there? I mean, is
So,
it estradiol safe, not safe, or is it actually to do with the
yeah.
balance of progesterone and so on?
Yeah. So with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, as I've already said, every single cell in our body has estrogen receptors on it. Some people have estrogen receptor negative breast cancer, and that means the cancer has mutated so much it's lost its estrogen receptors or estradiol receptors. So if I gave you a bit of my little finger, it would have estradiol receptors on it. If I had a cancer of my lung, it would have estradiol receptors on it if it was an early stage, early grade. So it doesn't mean estrogens caused it. It just means that's part of the body. There have been studies that show blocking estrogen with estrogen blockers can reduce sort of mortality. It can improve outcome from estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. But it's a very grey area, because are they blocking estrone or are they blocking estradiol? We know there are some harms with these treatments because they have an increased risk of osteoporosis and so forth. But also, when we think about cancer formation, there's not just one thing that causes cancer. There's lots of changes that occur. So it could never be just estradiol. You have to have an inflammatory response. There has to be DNA changes. Sometimes it's a genetic thing. There's all sorts of things that are going on. And again, it's very simplistic medicine to say estrogen is the culprit, let's block it. The way tamoxifen works, for example, it's a selective estrogen receptor modulator, which basically means it can be pro and anti-estrogen. And we know that in the past, they used to give high-dose estrogen tablets to women as a treatment for breast cancer. So there aren't any studies that show that estrogen is bad after breast cancer. We haven't got good studies because no one's done them. So there's a lot of confusion out there, and I see so many women who are denied hormones, yet they were young when they had their breast cancer diagnosis. Their periods come back, they feel a lot better. Then they have a menopause because they're older, and everyone's saying, no, 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 you can't have hormones. Well, you've had hormones because you've had natural periods. So again, so much more research needs to be done because, as you say, Patrick, breast cancer is so common. And a lot of women want to have a debate. Do they want progesterone? Do they want testosterone? It's not all just about estradiol. And when I think and worry, as I do, about the effects on the brain as we age, how many of these women have been denied hormones that might help their brain health going forwards?
Now, this might have changed, but I understood some years ago that the French were very into these bioidentical natural
Mm,
hormones, combining estradiol with natural progesterone, not synthetic
mm,
progestogens. And some very, very big studies, or in some cases, we would say surveys, not actual ask,
mm,
because you can't really do that. And with no indication at all of increased cancer risk if using progesterone and natural
yeah.
estradiol. Is that pretty much the case still?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the French studies, the E3N study, was good. You know, a lot of observational data is actually good. You'll never get good randomized control studies in lots of things, but you don't always need it. You know, we didn't have a randomized control study about penicillin. We didn't have it about smoking and lung cancer. So a lot of it is using common sense. And of course, it's always better to have the natural form. A lot of people have got very confused with this bioidentical, body identical. What does it mean? Is it licensed? Is it safe? And of course, in my clinic, we usually only prescribe the natural body identical hormones. So the natural estradiol through the skin, because it can go straight to the bloodstream, natural progesterone, and the testosterone. Again, people get confused with testosterone because if it's an injection, it's often synthetic. People in local gyms are probably doing all sorts of weirdly chemically altered testosterones. Whereas the natural testosterone will stimulate the receptors, have these lovely biological effects. So, absolutely, the French were ahead of their time, really, and we have caught up. You know, that's really important when women talk about HRT. They have to be very specific about what they're taking. Is it the natural replica? Is it the same as their natural hormones? Because it should be.
Now, just before we move on to the process of how you diagnose and treat and the use of these natural hormones, you reminded me of a study. It was a breast cancer cell study, so which used either tamoxifen, which is a relative estrogen
Mm,
receptor blocker, or genistein. And the reason I bring this up is not just for the study itself, but for the confusion, because genistein is a phytoestrogen, a
mm,
plant estrogen, which are naturally rich in beans and lentils and
mm,
all sorts of foods like soya, for example.
mm,
And some people in some countries, because it's very geographically oriented, think soya is the devil, phytoestrogens are the devil, because they've got estrogen in the word, which they think
mm,
is bad. And yet, what happened in the study is the tamoxifen was as good, sorry, the genistein was as good as the tamoxifen and actually helped the tamoxifen to work,
mm,
which
mm,
then produced a similar effect on a much lower dose with less toxicity. So,
mm.
phytoestrogens in plants, good or bad?
Well, I think it's very interesting because phytoestrogens are like weak estrogens, really, and they probably do have some beneficial effects. If you're going to take phytoestrogens for your menopause, you're probably going to have to eat a lot, and a lot more than you probably would. So they're probably not harmful, but they're not the same as the pure estradiol. So I think they obviously have other benefits with the vitamins and minerals and everything else that they have in them. There's been always a debate that, oh, certain populations like Japanese eat more soy, therefore they don't have hot flushes, but they still have a really high incidence of osteoporosis in menopause. So they might help some symptoms, but they're not going to reduce inflammation that keep bones strong as natural hormones would. So I think we just have to be careful. Like if we're taking something because we're scared of hormones, like what are we doing it for, really?
Yes, because some people are supplementing red clover and
Mm,
genistein and some sort of,
mm,
concentrates of these things. And of course, the Chinese women also come to mind, the traditional
yeah.
Chinese peasant diet, very high in soya and lots of other wonderful plant foods and fish.
Yeah, and I think it depends on where the source is. So if you're getting it from plants and vegetables, then you know what you're taking. If you're taking it in a bottle and it's labeled natural menopause supplement, it probably isn't safe. And anything, as you know, we put in our mouths gets metabolized through our liver and is what it gets converted into, or any potential damage it does to our liver is really important. So it's often not the actual ingredient, it's what else is made if it's coming in a bottle.
So how do you diagnose? In other words, how do you identify that a woman with these kind of symptoms is suffering as a consequence of hormonal deficiencies? So you've got your clinics and a number of
Mm,
clinicians. Perhaps you could give us
mm.
an idea of what's actually happening out there. It's not just you in
Yeah.
one place.
No, so I mean, I set up my clinic several years ago, and it's hard actually because the women we see in our clinic are women that have been underserved by the NHS. They've been told that it's not their hormones or it's all in their mind, and half of them are on hormones, but they're still having symptoms. So there's no good diagnostic test. Hormone levels can be a guide, especially if we think someone's
You mean blood
testosterone
hormone
deficient. Yeah, yeah, but they're not diagnostic. It's not like if I was trying to diagnose diabetes in someone, I would do their blood glucose level and pretty much have a diagnosis then and there. But because our hormones fluctuate in perimenopause, levels can be normal and women can still have symptoms. So often it's a diagnosis of exclusion. We will often do blood tests to make sure their thyroid or their iron level or vitamin D, for example, is normal. But taking a really good history is crucial. We're all GPs, so we've been trained very holistically. We look at the whole picture. But sometimes we don't always know. It's the same if I was diagnosing someone with migraine, I don't always do a brain scan. I take a careful history and then decide and give the appropriate treatment. If the treatment doesn't work, I might think of another diagnosis and another treatment. So the same with hormonal changes. Often we'll say to women, it sounds like it could be related to your hormones. The women often think it's related to their hormones too. And then we start them on some hormones, and then we can monitor their blood test to see how they're absorbing their hormones and review them and work out whether they're improving or not.
and some use saliva tests. Do you favor blood tests?
Yeah, so saliva tests aren't that accurate because they can change a lot. So we don't do saliva tests. We don't do dried urine tests. Blood tests for estrogen and testosterone can be useful, but they can still change. Blood tests for progesterone we don't do because it can change so much. But anything in medicine, when we do a test, it has to be in clinical context. So I worry about people who just go and buy tests without someone advising them about what they mean as well. So they can be useful, especially if someone's using estrogen patches, for example, and they're still getting symptoms. I want to know, are they absorbing? But the levels in the blood are not going to be the same as the levels in the brain, for example. So, we have to use our clinical judgment a lot of times as well.
And then when you say that the treatment would involve, natural hormones, bioidentical hormones,
Mm,
so you've mentioned estradiol, you've mentioned
mm,
progesterone, you've mentioned testosterone.
yeah.
Given that the sort of clinical diagnosis is based on a lot of symptoms and just
Mm.
and ruling things out, is there a sort of general starting point? Do you give a lot of women those three and then see what happens?
Yeah, so if someone's menopausal, they're not having periods, and they've still got their womb, we certainly start with estradiol and progesterone. Sometimes we'll start testosterone as well, or sometimes when we review them, if they're getting symptoms of testosterone deficiency, which is often affecting their cognition, their mood, muscle and joint pain, sleep, for example, and their testosterone levels low, we'll try testosterone. If someone's got really awful PMS or PMDD and they're just having symptoms for a few days before their periods, we might quite often just give them progesterone, the natural progesterone, on its own. They might not need those other hormones. Or we might see women who are having very regular periods, but they have lots of symptoms of testosterone deficiency, low testosterone. So we might try testosterone. So it's very individualized. And then the dose, some women need higher doses, some women need lower doses, it really varies.
And is this transdermal or other means of delivery? What do you
Yeah, so the estradiol is through the skin, so usually transdermal. So that's usually a patch or a gel. Our skin is a barrier, of course. It's not made to have things going through it. So sometimes people need a higher dose to get adequate through the skin, to penetrate through the skin. Progesterone doesn't really work through the skin. So we tend to give it either orally, there's micronized progesterone, which means it's just being sort of ground into small particles, suspended in some oil, so to help the absorption, or it can be given as a pessary, so vaginally or rectally, and then it goes through the mucous membrane straight into the bloodstream as the pure progesterone. And then testosterone, again, is transdermally. It's either a gel or a cream that again goes through the skin into the bloodstream. And then we mustn't forget, I know we're supposed to be talking about the brain, but we do use vaginal hormones for people with urinary tract symptoms, and also vaginal dryness and soreness. And those can be taken and used with or without systemic HRT.
another mucous membrane that would absorb very well?
Yes, but these are very low doses. So, for example, if women maybe have had breast cancer, they're choosing not to take hormones, but they're getting localized symptoms, they literally are very low doses. They don't get absorbed into the body, so they can work very well for local symptoms.
So, two questions there. Many people will think of testosterone as drive, sex drive, this sort of
Yeah,
male kind of aggressive thing. Can you, I mean, number one, does it work if you've lost, desire
yeah.
for sex? And number two, can it make you more aggressive, in that way?
So
What
yeah,
happens
it's
with
funny,
testosterone?
isn't it, that everyone thinks testosterone makes people like really manly and a bit cross, and actually it has lots of really important effects in the body. Um, the studies in women mainly have been done looking at libido, and I'm not quite sure. There's lots of maybe socio-economic, political reasons why it's only been looking at libido, but the studies have shown that women's libido can improve with testosterone. But libido in women is not just a hormone. We're a bit more complicated than that. But it works all over our brains. So a lot of people, we've just had a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal showing that women who use testosterone in addition to HRT, their mood, their memory, their concentration, their muscle joint pains, headaches, migraines improve, which we see a lot. So a lot of people, when they take it, it's a very low dose, so they don't get this anger, aggression, this sort of a lot of people think it's an anabolic steroid, it's going to build their muscles and they're going to have this weird body shape, but that would be the synthetic testosterone. The natural testosterone at low doses that are adequate for women, people just tend to get benefits. We don't have women in our clinic that are shaving every day or have voice changes, because it's just a natural supplement, if you like. It's just replacing what's missing in the body.
You've already said that so much of this is made from cholesterol. Obviously,
Mm,
as a nutritionist, I think of the cofactors that make this
yes.
happen. I think of methylation. I think of B
Mm,
vitamins.
mm,
This talk of fats makes me think of the omega-3 as well,
mm.
antioxidants. So, is there sort of a support package in relation to diet,
Yeah.
supplement?
It's really, really important. I think a lot of people think that my work is you give hormones and you rub your hands with glee and that's it. Of course, that would be ridiculous. We have to be thinking about obviously nutrition and exercise, but a lot of people do take supplements. I mean, I personally take supplements, but I take it for my health, not for my menopause, if that makes sense. So there's a big meno washing, it's billions of dollar industry where anything labeled menopause, people are clamoring to buy. But I take omega-3, I take a good quality magnesium supplement with vitamin B, because that's helping my brain health, but I'm not taking it for my hormones as such. But of course, it's going to help my hormonal health as well as my, so many cell processes, because we want to reduce inflammation. We want to keep our cardiovascular system good. We want to keep those neurons fired up and working. And, I don't need to tell you, Patrick, but the brain is the most important organ of our body. So many people don't realize that our ovaries are connected to our brain, but so is our metabolism, our liver, our lungs, our heart. It's all connected to our brain. So anything that's going to improve our brain health, whether it's supplements, whether it's food, whether it's exercise, whether it's just having good social connections, all of these are going to help in the presence of course, hormones as well.
Now, another substance you mentioned, which we could call a hormone or a neurotransmitter, is melatonin.
Yeah.
We're learning is way, way more than the
Mm.
promoter of sleep, because at night our melatonin
Mm.
goes up. Vitamin D is similar.
Yeah.
Whether you call it a hormone, it is really a hormone, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
It has so many wide
Yeah.
effects. So tell us a little bit about melatonin and perhaps even vitamin D, if that's relevant
Well,
in
I
this
think I
process.
think it's all relevant, and I'm writing a book at the moment about hormones, and I go a lot into the history of hormones, and a lot of it, like I've already said, is this commercialization. But what a shame that we've commercialized estradiol, progesterone, testosterone to an extent that people are scared of them. But also, we've trivialized vitamin C and melatonin to the fact that they're forgotten, really. And vitamin D is such an important hormone to reduce inflammation. People think, oh, it's a sunlight vitamin, it might help with bone strength, but it helps in so many cell processes. And we know that a lot of people with chronic diseases, so any inflammatory disease, so obviously dementia, but also cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, clinical depression, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These people will have low testosterone. Most people in a hospital will have low testosterone. And in fact, the other day I said to my husband, who's a surgeon, do you ever measure vitamin D in your patients? He said, no, because it's always low. Right, do you ever treat? Do you ever give vitamin D? Oh, why would I do that? And as a GP, I used to prescribe vitamin D a lot, and then we were stopped from prescribing it because we were told it's so cheap, people can buy it. Well, the areas that I've worked in as a GP are very deprived. So people have spent their money on cigarettes and booze, not vitamin D. So if it's not available on a free prescription, they won't take it. And it's very harmful for our health not having vitamin D. I mean, it's very hard in the UK, isn't it, to get enough sunshine to get you enough vitamin D. Melatonin is the same. It's a very good hormone. It's very calming. It works with our other neurotransmitters. Obviously, it helps with sleep. Yet we can't really even prescribe it. We can't buy it over the counter. I've recently been in Singapore and Australia. I bought melatonin. It helped me tremendously with my jet lag. I get migraines if I don't sleep. I have a really hectic schedule. Like melatonin was transformational for me on the planes and traveling. Yeah, I can't even prescribe it to people over here unless there's certain criteria, but it's really safe.
No, it's a crazy thing. And whenever I'm traveling, I buy as a lovely
Mm,
product in America, 10 milligrams, 5 milligram fast release,
yeah,
5 milligrams slow release. Lovely.
yeah,
And then I was just talking to a cancer expert the other day, and they're
yeah.
using 50 to 100 milligrams
Wow.
as an
Yeah,
incredibly powerful antioxidant.
yeah.
You know,
It
so
doesn't
so
surprise me.
a bit like vitamin D. And I'll tell you a funny
Mm,
story about vitamin D. I got busted about 10 years ago when I ran a campaign saying that everyone needed to take vitamin D in the winter. I
mm,
got reported
mm,
to the Advertising Standards Authority because one of their rules is you cannot imply that you cannot get all
mm,
the nutrients you need to well-balanced diet. And I gave them all the evidence. They said it's not about the evidence. You just cannot tell people that they need vitamin D in the winter. And by the way, a simple rule of thumb is if your shadow is longer than
yeah,
your the height of your body, you're not making vitamin
yeah,
D. So we're just now getting to the
mm,
point where we can make vitamin D. And tragically, despite the fact, I mean, I did think when the government started to announce that everyone has to supplement vitamin D in the winter of reporting them to the ASA, but life's too short.
Decided not to, yeah. But
Uh,
it's all about nomenclature. So if we suddenly said vitamin D is a hormone, people would be scared of it, wouldn't they? But then they've almost taken, oh, it's only a vitamin, I don't need it. But it's so
yeah,
important.
and less than 5% of people supplement vitamin D in the winter, despite
Yeah,
government.
I know. It's tragic.
So here we are. We're moving into sort of medical area, not self-help situation.
Mm,
How would a concerned woman be able to get assessed and then get prescribed natural hormones? Can a GP
yeah.
prescribe these natural
Yeah.
hormones?
So everything I do in my clinic, we is the same as an NHS GP. The only difference is we have more time with our patients. But I've created Balance, a free app that anyone can download from App Store or Google Play. Just
It's
search
called again?
Balance. So it's just Balance. You can just search Balance Menopause, it will come up. And that people can monitor symptoms, they can track their symptoms, but there's lots of information. We're adding information all the time. And I have a website, drlouisenewson.co.uk, with my weekly podcast. There's hundreds of articles there as well that are all evidence-based. So what I'm finding more and more, not just in the UK, but globally, women are educating themselves. They're working out what they want to do and how they want to manage their hormonal changes themselves. And then they're often going to their healthcare professional, their doctor, nurse, pharmacist, someone who can prescribe, and saying, look, I would like to try hormones, I would like to try testosterone. And increasingly, doctors are prescribing. There are a lot of doctors, sadly, who are not trained in menopause. It's not a standard education pathway that people have knowledge about something that affects 51% of the population. Don't ask me why. But it is changing, and a lot of GPs are embracing this and learning more. If people aren't getting the right help and treatment that they want, they can see someone else, and it's absolutely fine to see a different doctor. A lot of people who come to our clinic might only come once or twice. So once they're on the right treatment, they're feeling better. We write very detailed consultation letters. Then the GPs say, oh, good, I know what to prescribe now. And then they carry on the prescribing. So we work very closely with GPs in that way.
And I know you're in the Midlands, but do you have a group of practitioners in other areas?
Yeah, so my clinic's in Stratford upon Avon, but we also have we work under the umbrella of HCA in Wimpole Street in London, but we also do a lot of online consultations. So a lot of people who work with me do online consultations too. So people can choose whether they want to go face to face or online.
And this is Alzheimer's Prevention Day is creeping upon us on
Yes.
May the 20th. It's our second World Alzheimer's Prevention Day. So this month of May is very much about exploring all the topics that
Mm,
relate to this. And remember at the beginning, women develop a higher
mm,
risk of cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's. One of the sort of unspoken factors here is hormonal imbalance. So if you're listening and you go, oh, my God, this sounds like me. You've got the app Balance.
mm.
It's always a
Yeah.
balanced
Just balance, balance.
balance for
Yeah.
hormones. So that's a very good place to start. And you can track your symptoms and get involved. And how would someone find your clinic or and your group of GPs?
So, well, the easiest thing is just to Google me. So, Dr Louise Newson, one word, .co.uk, and then information about me and everything else is there. And just be empowered with knowledge. We've known for decades how important our hormones are on our brain and our memory. We know the longer a woman is without hormones, the greater the risk of dementia. We do know that dementia can reduce in women who take natural hormones. Some of the studies have confused natural and synthetic. That's why there's confusion out there. So we need to be thinking more grown up way about the role of hormones in our brain.
And another confusion I'd like to clarify, I hope I have this right, is that basically what you're doing in giving these often transdermal natural hormones is giving them at a physiological level. In other words, a level
Yeah,
that the body would normally produce when
yeah.
younger, because some people are concerned that if you give these, it stops your body making its own and you sort of become dependent on them in some way. So could you just clarify
Yeah,
that point?
yeah. All we're doing is, I mean, they're called hormone replacement, but it actually is just hormone treatment. So if we're giving them to young women or women who are still having their own periods, we're just matching the deficit. We're just giving a small amount. When people are menopausal, once their hormone levels drop from their ovaries, they are low forever. So then we are just replacing. And it's important to have the right amount, because if women have too low a dose, there's still increased inflammation. There's still a risk of osteoporosis and heart disease. So having the right amount is crucial. And so that's why we monitor people and review them every year.
And how long do they take to work? That's important. Is it a day, a week, a month? 2 months?
Well, it really varies actually. So I know when I started hormones, I was just desperate and I was gutted that a few weeks later I didn't feel much better. A lot of times, like vasomotor symptoms, flushes and sweats can improve quite quickly, but the brain symptoms can take, 3, 6 months, even if you're on the right treatment to improve. I see a lot of women in my clinic who have very dark thoughts, very intrusive thoughts, and they can take a while to improve. But if you visualize these neurons, these nerve cells growing, regenerating, the synapse is working. It's if you've got sort of wires that are a bit rusty and you're having to rewire the plug and do all this rewire, it takes a while, and the cells have got to relearn, and sometimes you've got to wait for new cells to be forming that then respond to the hormones better. And it's not just these biological changes in the cells, it's the DNA changes that can occur with the hormones. So it can take quite a few weeks. So patience, which I don't often have, but patience is a virtue when you start with hormones. It's
And
a bit
that's
like if you exercise, you're not going to exercise once and feel the benefits.
Yeah, that's what Dr. John Lee said. He said the receptors have to sort of come back to life when
Yeah,
suddenly there's enough estradiol and progesterone and
yeah.
testosterone available. So we said give it a 3 month shot. And there are
Mm,
cells in our bodies, like our red blood cells, which take 3 months
yeah,
to renew. So you may not get
absolutely.
instant effects, but it's worth hanging in there. So I just want to end and remind people that you've written a very brilliant book, The Definitive Guide to the Perimenopause and Menopause. Sunday Times bestseller. It's available presumably everywhere, including Amazon and your website. And
Yes, and a Kindle version is and a one that I've read as well, so people can audible it if they
Audible
want to
and
listen to my
Kindle.
voice reading it
So,
out. Yeah.
yeah, so you've got a lot of ways to get informed, get involved, and make sure that your brain as a woman is super protected and you don't have to suffer from any of these symptoms. So Dr. Louise Newson, thank you very much for sharing all your wisdom and insights.
Oh, well, thanks again for the invitation. It's been great.